Welcome to the micro video entitled Interrupters, an Educational Strategy. The objectives are listed below. You should be able to define what an interrupter is that can be inserted into a lecture or video presentation, discuss the evidence that interrupters increase retention, and finally, at the completion of listening to this, be able to design, using a lecture that you have given to medical learners, 3 different interrupters that could be used in your lecture presentation. I'd like to ask you a question. First of all, I'll make a statement. We, as reproductive endocrinologists, believe in evidence-based medicine. But do we believe in evidence-based education? Do we embrace and systematically apply evidence-based learning strategies and neurocognitive science to educate ourselves and our learners? First, I'm going to start with what could be a live example of an interrupter if I was giving you a lecture. I could stop at this point and say, let's do a pair and share. Turn to the person next to you and discuss the following question. If you'd like to pause your video to do this, please feel free to do so. On average, how long is it before learners' attentions wane during a lecture? Or I could use an audience response system and ask the following question. If immediately tested after a 50-minute lecture, learners are more likely to remember material in the first 10 minutes or material in the last 10 minutes, and then poll the audience of learners regarding their response. What is the answer to these 2 questions? I have several studies in the next several slides. All of them are referenced by the primary author at the bottom. What is a learner's attention span in a lecture? There are numerous studies on this, and they all come in at approximately 15 minutes. To be truthful, you do not need a study to do this. Just sit in the back of a lecture hall and watch the Google come up at about 15 minutes. What is the retention immediately after a lecture? You might expect that if you tested immediately after a lecture, you would remember the material presented in the last 10 minutes better. But in reality, you remember the material in the first 10 minutes better. In fact, 70% of that compared to 20% in the last. Why? Because attention has waned, of course. Now, I'd like to go over a couple studies about interrupters and their benefit. This is an interrupter. The article was entitled, Hit the Pause Button. The lecturer in a college-level course gave 3 2-minute pauses during his or her 45-minute lecture versus a traditional lecture with no pauses. There were a total of 5 lectures across 1.5 weeks in this course. Immediately after the 5 lectures, students were asked for a free recall of fact. Students in the pause group were much more likely to remember free recall facts than students in the traditional group. But what probably is much more impressive is their performance on multiple choice questions. This study was repeated over 2 separate semesters, and as you can see, the pause group had statistical difference in terms of their multiple choice question responses compared to the traditional group. Now you might say, well, that's all good and well. That's in a college-level course. What about medicine? And this is in first-year medical students of a 50-minute lecture with 3 pauses of 2 to 3 minutes compared again to a traditional lecture control. And the study again showed that the experimental group did better on multiple choice testing, in this case 15 days after all of the lectures, as is noted here. Now, what about the audience response? That is one of the most common interrupters that is used in medical education from medical students through postgraduate courses. People often say, gosh, to have to write all those questions is difficult. But I'd like to make a point about ARS questions and how they differ from test questions. The goal of ARS questions is to enhance learning. The goal of a test question is assessment. We are trying to separate achievement levels of learners. So it is less difficult, in my opinion, to write a question for an ARS. And in fact, we can break the rule that we would have in assessment questions and have incorrect responses. And in fact, this sometimes helps uncover misperceptions of the learner. Now, there are a lot of modifications to interrupters. I call this interrupter squared. For example, one can combine an ARS and a pair and share. Let's say you have a question and your class does poorly on that question when you look at the polling. You can have them then discuss with each other in groups of 2 to 4 the answer and teach each other, and then re-poll to see if you have a better response. And of course, there are many other variations that faculty have used, and one can be creative in finding these interrupter modifications. And here is one. If you happen to have the software that is able to do this with clickable images, you can ask your learners to put their pointer where they think the lesion is, and then they will click it, and you will see up on your screen all the clicks of where people think a lesion is. This really helps uncover misperceptions. Here's another modification of a pair and share on steroids, as I call it, that I've used in my contraceptive population health lecture at Dartmouth. I tell the members of the class that they are now the new Secretary of Health and Human Services, and they need to come up with 5 strategies. President Obama, as you can see, signed this letter since it was dated April 2016. 5 strategies that they would implement in order to solve this problem of unintended pregnancies. During the rest of the lecture, then, they get points if they find a strategy is on their list that has data in back of it, and they lose points if their strategy has data that does not indicate that it is a good strategy. So this keeps them involved in the lecture, and of course there are some ARSs also within that lecture. There are other modifications. A common one is using a case-based curriculum or a mini case-based curriculum, a small case, and then have learners solve it in pairs. And then you can use that either as a springboard for your next lecture segment around that case, or you can go the other way, use the mini case after you have given a mini lecture within the time. But of course, the discussions that the pairs have act as an interrupter. So final thoughts, why are interrupters a good cognitive strategy? Well, as I've showed you, they increase retention. Second of all, they're very easy to insert in a lecture format, of which we all have many of. They allow creativity, and they also allow modification that may be appropriate to the subject being taught. And finally, perhaps as important, except for the retention, is they give us as faculty feedback on learning struggles. For example, it can facilitate our ability to restructure our last minutes of time for an unexpected misperception. And finally, in my opinion, interrupters make teaching more fun. Thank you very much.